Karen Wagner, and I am one of the newest board members to the MainStream Coalition. We welcome you tonight, and we're so glad that you got out of the house and got out of shoveling for a while and joined us here. Education is so important, and it's been a really big part of my life in many ways, and we're just really, really glad that you're here. I'd also like to thank our guest speakers, Mr. Traebert and Dr. Trigg, for joining us and giving the presentation. And we will have cards that you can fill out for questions. So if any time you feel like you have a question, you can fill out the card and somebody will be along to pick that question up. I'd like to thank Colonial Church for hosting it. It's always great that, to have a space that we can get together and gather as a community and talk about these issues. What is MainStream? What does it stand for and what it's all about? It stands for a Moderate Alliance of Informed Neighbors. And the biggest part of what we do is promote the separation of church and state with an emphasis on public education and religious freedom. Tonight's program is the second in a monthly 5-part series where we will be discussing the critical issues that are facing Kansas during the 2013 legislative session. I, myself, like I said, my name is Karen Wagner, and I have had a child in the public school system for 17 years. Not the same child, but several. I became involved very, very early. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Okay. I got involved in the schools regarding education issues very early on. There were things going on in my child's school that I became concerned about, and this is back in the 90s, early 2000s. And I thought to myself, why? Why is this happening, and what is going on that some of these changes are happening? So I did what I think everybody should do, and that is I went and asked questions. Now, I went to my building principal, I went to school board members, I went to talk to other parents, and at that time, the issues were the changing formula to unfunding the formula. There was lots of things that were happening, and I happen to have my kids in Shawnee Mission, but I know some of you are from all parts of the areas, and so I got involved with the PTA and had spent most of my volunteer hours working with the PTA. And it kind of led me to the how. How did some of these things that were happening, how were we going to survive these uncertain times? Which led me to the who. And the who is that public schools are funded and operated. They're by the state government and legislature. So I really found that it was important to reach out to my representative. And I'll tell you, we don't always agree on every single issue. But that has never stopped me from talking to them about this issue. And that's why we're having this forum, because there needs to be a dialogue about education. And I really encourage you to do that. As far as my involvement in PTA, I kept hearing from parents saying, why are my class sizes large? Why are they closing my school? Why? There's lots of whys. And so I'm hoping that from tonight's program that you might be able to see some of the issues that are facing our schools. As far as this legislation or the legislature is concerned, there's so many bills written. I couldn't even begin to touch on all of them, but it runs the gamut from reorganizing the Kansas High School Athletics Association to a constitutional amendment on Article 6 regarding public education. I hope that no one takes public education for granted. I don't. my father became an orphan at the age of 10. And the public school was his opportunity, it was his community. The teacher provided a resource to him and his siblings that was so important to who he was and is. And so, with that, I just really encourage you to listen, learn, and take this information and do something with it. I'd like to thank Harry McDonald and Sherilyn Smith for putting this program together. And our moderator tonight is Harry McDonald, and he is a lifelong educator and a long member of the MainStream board.
Welcome tonight. And since Karen set the stage for why it's important to have this forum tonight, we decided that the MainStream Program Committee decided we wanted to present a diversity of information to you tonight as you decide where you stand on some of these educational issues. So we have two speakers with, on most issues, fairly different approaches to education, to the finance of education and to the delivery of service. Our first speaker tonight will be Dave Traebert. Wave, Dave. President of Kansas Policy Institute, which is a privately funded think tank that advocates for market solutions and the protection of personal freedoms for all Kansans. Dave speaks frequently on education issues. In addition to his work for KPI, Dave is on the Fiscal Policy Task Force for the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, which is an organization that does suggest legislation nationwide, writes sample legislation, which does get introduced in many states across the country. Our second speaker tonight is Tom Trigg, who is the superintendent of Blue Valley Schools and has been the superintendent since 2004, was in 2011 named Kansas Superintendent of the Year and was one of 4 finalists for National Superintendent of the Year, and has been a teacher and administrator since 1974. For the format tonight, we will ask each speaker to take about 15 minutes to present whatever information they want, followed by questions from the audience and from this moderator. And Dave Morantz is around someplace. Here he is with cards. And those of you that have been at these forums before know the drill. This anytime that you want a card, raise your hand and catch Dave's eye, and he'll hand you a card. And throughout the evening, you can feed those back to him, and he'll submit them. It's only fair to tell you that with this many people, we will be taking questions and bundling them so that if we have a number of questions that are essentially on the same topic, we'll try to tie that all together into maybe one question for the speakers. Okay, so if you don't hear your exact words, but you hear your topic, it may be one of those bundled questions. We have asked our speakers to focus on how the new tax plan will or has affected school funding, on the deep cuts to districts and how those have, how they've accommodated those changes with the limited funding. Asked them to comment on the legislation calling for a constitutional amendment to remove citizens' rights to sue for suitable funding for education, and on legislation introduced to severely limit personal and professional rights of teachers and their professional organizations. And we've asked them to really try to be ready to respond to questions about any of a variety of bills that are in front of the legislature now dealing with education.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Traebert. I'm president of Kansas Policy Institute. It is a pleasure to be here, and I have to say, you are really to be commended. This organization you put together to get this kind of a turnout on any topic is not common around the state. I've done this quite a few times, and this is one of the biggest crowds I've ever seen, it's really commendable because we need more citizens to get involved and really understand, because it really doesn't matter what, frankly, a legislator thinks, or what I think, or what Dr. Trigg thinks. It really matters only what you think. because you're the taxpayers, you're the citizens. And so our job, my job, is to try to help you and everybody else we talk to just get the facts so you can make your own fully informed decisions. Now, some of the facts we'll give you and you'll see tonight might not be what you're used to seeing, but every single thing I'm going to show you comes from government. It either comes from your local school district or the State Department of Education, or it comes from the U.S. Department of Education. Let me start by just giving you a quick background on what Kansas Policy Institute is and what we try to accomplish. We're an independent, oh, I didn't do the, no, there we go. It's just one at a time. We have offices in Wichita and just recently in Overland Park. We're down at 130th and Metcalf. By the way, I'm looking for a place to live, so if anybody has it, my wife and I have been through Prairie Village a few times and love this area. So as soon as we sell our house in Wichita, we're going to be looking. But so we have two offices in the state. We've been around since 1996, and we really focus on education, tax and fiscal policy, and healthcare issues. Basically, what we try to do is help people understand that the trade-offs that you're usually presented with are not that. And for example, the trade-off for tax reform is big service cuts. That's not true. That's the way it gets presented. In fact, that's the way government sometimes implements something like that. What we help people understand that it's not that either or, it's more of an eat your cake and have it too. There are ways that you can have low taxes and good quality services. And in fact, you not only can, you must, because that's the only way with that combination. That's the only way that you're going to have sustained economic growth and job creation. You can't just cut spending to cut taxes. You have to do it. You have to have the balance. But that's kind of what we do to help people go through that. So what's at stake? Well, what's at stake in this case with education is clearly it's the future of thousands of Kansas children. Now, a lot of our kids are fortunate and they do very well in school and get a very good public education in Kansas. There's no question about that. But that's not the case for all kids in Kansas. And we have to be, and it's one of the things I really appreciate about this part of the state is, as evidenced by this turnout, you don't just care about your kid or your grandchildren, you care about your neighbor's kid or the kid you don't even know. That's a little bit different. I'm not sure what's in the water here in Johnson County, but it is a little bit different than we see around the state, and it's really encouraging. And it's intuitive to think that it's kind of the way Americans approach problems. If there's a problem, throw money at it. And sometimes money, and there's no question that money is important, but money isn't the issue here. It costs a lot of money to run schools, but I did this for a PC and it's on a Mac, but money isn't, and there's no question, again, I want to repeat that, it costs a lot of money to run schools, but it's more about how the money is spent that matters, not how much. And just to give you an example, probably a lot of people aren't aware that last year we set a record in Kansas for taxpayer-supported public schools at $5.77 billion. And this year the Department of Education says we're going to break that record at $5.816 billion. That's about $12,738 per pupil on average. It's a little bit varies based on a lot of different formulas, but that's the total that the Department of Education says that we're going to spend this year. So that's a lot of money. And if that's what it takes, then that's what we have to spend. But the interesting thing about the money that we've spent, over the last 7 years, taxpayer support of schools has increased by about $1.5 billion. But the achievement, and this is what really matters, money's important, but it's the outcomes that matter. Student achievement on independent national tests has not changed. In fact, it hasn't changed since 1998. When we go back, and that was 1998 was the first year that Kansas participated in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Their standards haven't changed. Their standards have been consistent. And over that period of time, as you'll see, spending went up dramatically, as it did in a lot of states. But the achievement levels didn't change. And the achievement is what we really want to focus on. when parents understand that what the achievement levels are, and I want to show you, these are some of the facts you probably aren't aware of about student achievement. And keep in mind that this all comes from the Department of Education and that, or the local school district. And this is going to be disconcerting to some of you, I'm sure. It was to me when I first saw it. But I really look at this, it's like taking our kids, or now my granddaughter, to the doctor. I don't want to go and hear bad news. I only want to hear good things. But if the doctor sees something wrong or might be wrong and doesn't tell me, I can't help that child get better. So we can't shy away from what might be uncomfortable information. We have to look at the facts. And this is not in any way about attacking anyone. It's not saying it's the teacher's fault, it's the school's fault, it's the superintendent's fault. Not at all. When we talk about this, we try to say, look, let's take the approach, this is no one's fault and everyone's responsibility. We have to know where we are so we can make plans to move forward. So, let's talk about proficient. This is the definition from Merriam-Webster's. Proficient is well advanced in an art, occupation, or branch of knowledge. Now I'm going to show you three different definitions of proficient. Proficiency with difficult, rigorous, and formidable materials observed. Students who perform at the proficient level demonstrate a mastery of core skills, and the proficient student has satisfactory comprehension. Which one of these three, how many people think the first definition closely matches or is the closest match to what Merriam-Webster says is proficient? Okay. How many people think the second definition is the one that closely matches? What about the third one? Most of you aren't sure, and I understand. The truth is here, all three of these are definitions that have been used or are being used in Kansas. Proficiency with difficult, rigorous, and formidable material was the definition of proficiency used by the Department of Education prior to 2002. In 2002 and through 2005, this next definition came in, and now the definition is that the proficient student has satisfactory comprehension. Satisfactory comprehension is a far cry from mastery of core skills and from using proficiency with difficult, rigorous, and formidable material. The Department of Education lowered the standards in Kansas. Now, 2002 is when No Child Left Behind started. That's when the federal government gave states this impossible task of saying every school has to be at 100% proficiency by 2014. That's what happens in Washington sometimes. You get, it sounds good, it feels good, let's all have 100% proficiency. They all knew it wasn't going to happen. So what they did was say states have to hit that, but they can set their own proficiency standards. So you can see here how Kansas Department of Education and the state board reacted. And as U.S. Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan says, they acted pretty much rationally like most states did. They lowered their standards. So now this is the definition. When reading grade appropriate material, the proficient student has satisfactory comprehension. In Kansas, our Department of Education defines full comprehension as advanced. Our standard is lower than full comprehension. That's one thing we need to understand. Now, here's what full comprehension looks like. The blue line here is what white kids in Kansas, and I only go back to 2006 because the department says based on the current standards, you can really only validly compare progress back to 2006 because they changed so much. Here's the achievement gaps, and by the way, Kansas is no different from most other states. These kind of achievement gaps are unfortunate and they're very unnecessary. It's not that the kids can't learn, they absolutely can. They just haven't had the same opportunity, the same access to education that other kids have had. Now, here's an example, and I apologize, that wasn't like that on the slide. It must be the Mac, but This is an example of some of the districts here in this area, and as you can see, the statewide average full comprehension in 4th grade is 62%, 64 in 8th grade, and 56 in 11th grade. That's another thing that's not, okay, I'll stay closer to the mic, sorry. That's something that's also not unusual across the country, to see the 11th grade number be the lowest. And that's because, the experts say that's because, oh, okay, thanks. That's because kids didn't get enough of the basics in the early years, they have a harder time keeping up as the material gets more complicated, more challenging. So in Kansas, the average, according to the Department of Education, and it's their definition of full comprehension, we're just repeating what they have, 56% statewide, 11th grade. Now, we used to be pretty close. Until we changed the standards, the proficiency levels in Kansas and across and on the national test were close. But as you can see here, we went from 34% proficient in 2001 to 65% proficient in 2002. That's what happens when you lower the standard. More kids qualify. It didn't mean the kids were any smarter or learning any more, which is the real point. It just meant we changed the standard and counted more kids as proficient. The U.S. Department of Education says Kansas has some of the lowest standards in the nation. 40 states have higher reading performance standards than Kansas does on 4th grade reading. In fact, our standard, what we consider proficient, according to the Department of Ed in Washington, what we consider proficient in Kansas is below basic on the national test. And below basic, by the way, is a polite way of saying functionally illiterate. According to the independent national tests, only 36% of our 4th grade kids are proficient, and less than half in math. According to ACT, 29% of the high school graduates scored well enough to be considered college ready on English, reading, math, and science. Now, I was amazed the other day. I was in a legislative hearing and I heard the School Board Association say that's a good thing. And their rationale was because the jobs in today's job market only require about 30% of those jobs require a college degree. So the fact that only 29% are considered college ready, they were actually saying that was a good thing. I had to shake my head to make sure I was hearing that right. That just doesn't make sense. But this is part of the 21% of the kids who graduate from Kansas, according to the regents, sign up for remedial training. It costs a lot of money to run schools. There's no question. But all the spending increase has not changed. Here's the ACT, same thing. ACT scores in Kansas have been about the same as they have been for years, while our spending's going up. We need to fund schools adequately, but that's just not the connection. Here are the facts. Here you can see the $5.771 billion, the $5.816 billion. I want to especially point out, because some people have been mistakenly told that state aid to schools is back to the 90s level. That's clearly not true. Here's something you need to understand on base state aid. The base is in the first column, and as you can see, that base hasn't changed much. But look, we pulled out the capers and the bond. The column in yellow is everything else. Now, we've always had in Kansas special education, at-risk, English language learners, all those other services used to be funded out of the base. When the formula was changed and weightings were added and expanded, it went on top of the base. So the money that for those services that used to have to come out of the base, now it's all on top. That money has gone from $178 per pupil to over $2,000 per pupil. So you cannot just look at base state aid when you're looking at what comes out of the state budget. There have been very large increases. Now, I wanted to quickly address the constitutional amendment, and a couple of the things that were in the letter you asked us to look at said removing the courts from school funding. That amendment wouldn't do that. And that amendment does not take suitable out of the Constitution. What it would do, the courts could still declare funding to be unconstitutional. What they couldn't do is say, fix it this way. because the Constitution also says only the legislature can appropriate money. Now, the court has remedies, so they can order the state to come back with something that they will deem to be constitutional. And they have recourse if the state wouldn't do that. This doesn't take the court out. All it says is you will abide by the separation of powers. You will determine whether this is constitutional or not. The legislative branch will determine how to fix it and how much to spend. And if they don't do it right, then you can send them right back to the drawing board. This does not take it out, and it does not remove suitable. The thing you need to really understand, and this is something that most people aren't aware of, that court case was based on a cost study called Augenblick and Myers in 2001. Now, Augenblick and Myers in their methodology said that they were supposed to determine what it cost to be, it's called their successful schools model. What does it cost to achieve the required outcomes and have schools operating efficiently? So they found these 85 districts that met both criteria. Then they decided that 50 of those were high spenders. And so they violated their own methodology, it's in their report, and they, instead of excluding the high spenders, they put them in. So they did not have any measure of efficiency in that study. Now, we did a public opinion poll about a month ago, and 74% of Kansans said, yeah, efficiency should be part of any decision. We want to make sure that regardless of what agency it is, we want them to have the money they need, but we expect them to also make good use of our money. Well, there's never been a study conducted in Kansas that looks at what does it cost to achieve the required outcomes and have schools organized and operating in a cost-effective manner. So what we think they should do is go through that process. I don't know why the state has never done that study, but they need to. Okay. So we should look at all the inputs, including the money, figure out how do we get things operating really on a student-focused basis, do a study, and fund it. It's common sense, pretty simple. But as Tom can probably tell you, he spends a little time in Topeka too. It's not always common sense and simple when you're talking about how legislation works. But that's just figure out what it really costs, do an honest-to-goodness study, and fund it. It's pretty simple. The tax plan. The tax plan is, on its own, is not going to have any impact on school funding. Okay. The tax plan, let me explain to you why the tax plan was necessary. And this was part of the rationale that convinced some skeptic legislators that they needed to do it. We did a study in 2011. We were talking about a fiscal cliff in Kansas long before they talked about it in Washington. If simply looking at what it would cost Kansas if we have the Affordable Care Act implemented, and now it's here, and if we had to fund our pension plan at a more reasonable rate of return and ensure that the money is actually there to pay retirement benefits, the only way we could do all that and keep everything else just running at its 1.9% annual growth rate was to have 6% private sector GDP growth consistently. And we've never had that in Kansas. We had a tax system that was not positioned to avoid going off that fiscal cliff. So something had to change. Now, what the governor has said is they're not going to reduce spending, and they haven't reduced school spending. And this comes back to you have to find ways to do both. You can't just cut taxes and whack spending. You have to do it both ways. You have to find ways, and frankly, that's the key to a lot of states, how they do it. The states that have the low tax burden and the double-digit job growth are the ones that keep their spending under control. They have public schools, they have highways, they have all the other services. They provide the same or better service, just at a better price. We've looked at the spending levels of every state, and that's the key, is finding that balance, making sure that government's using that money effectively. And I was going to cover union legislation, but if you want me to stop there, Terry? Okay, all right. Okay. All right,
Quickly.
this is the last one. All Paycheck Protection does is say that the government will not withhold any dues that will be used for political purposes. That's the only thing it does.
It's our money, it's our choice.
And it is everybody's choice to, and by the way, I would not have, that's what this law says, and it would apply equally to anything else. So it would be just in terms of what it's the role of government. It's not about what the individual does with their money, because the individuals are still able to make any kind of voluntary contributions they want. And it'd be no different than if Governor Brownback went around and said, would you like to make a voluntary contribution to my PAC? Now, if someone were to do that, there'd be some people who might feel obligated to do it because the card was put in front of them. Here's the interesting thing. This has broad public support. We did a public opinion poll. Only 12% of Kansans, this is a scientific poll, and it's the same company that did the poll that said Governor Brownback's approval ratings were in the tank. We picked them for a reason. They do very good work. They said 12% of Kansans said withhold all dues. 39% said only withhold regular dues. 30% said withhold no dues. The amazing thing about this was it didn't change hardly at all across whether it was regionally, whether it was self-identified party affiliation, self-identified ideology, conservative, moderate. As you can see here, moderate, only 10% of people who said they were moderate said that it's the role of government to withhold dues that are going to be used for political purposes. Government employees, union employees. This is a scientific poll, and what those folks said. This has broad public support. Now, the collective bargaining rules, the way that those are changing, this is kid-focused. Nothing makes more difference to education than having an effective teacher in a classroom. Nothing. So, Superintendent Trigg and other local school board members need the flexibility to decide how long the school day is, when the school calendar starts. The way that most union contracts are set up today, the union has veto power over those issues. So, I mean, just in conclusion, I mean, there's all this information is on in the packets in the back. We have, again, this is all data that comes only from the school districts, the Department of Education, or the U.S. Department of Education. And our focus is on getting every kid access to a great education. And we know that a lot of kids already have that in Kansas. But even the attorneys representing schools told the court that thousands of kids get left behind every year. And we need to be focused on those kids, on all the kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Thanks for having Dave. I think I want to start by saying if you came tonight for a debate, if you came for fireworks, you're going to be disappointed. No, I'm really serious about that. I think Dave and I both came to share information, and you know we're going to have some differing views, and that's okay. In fact, I'm here to say I think that's actually probably a good thing. I don't consider myself an expert. I really don't. I'm here to learn. I've heard Dave present 3, 4, 5 times now, and what I try to do is listen to what Dave says and see if there's anything that I can learn. See if there's a different vantage point or viewpoint that he's presenting that actually makes some sense and that might impact the way I think. And no, I'm really serious. In fact, let me just tell you, last night, woke up in the middle of the night, and of course, what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about coming here tonight. And thankfully, I wasn't thinking, why did I agree to do this? I probably should have been thinking that, but I wasn't. But rather, I was thinking, why are we so polarized? Why do we have in this country, and why do we have in this state, and why do we have even locally, you know, such extreme viewpoints? And we're so cemented in those. And what I think there's a number of reasons, but one thing that came to me and then really was kind of affirmed today, and I'm going to mention that to you, was the fact that so oftentimes I think we have this belief structure, we all do, within us, and then what we do is we go out and we try to gather data to support our position. And it's biased data because anything that doesn't support it, we don't want to listen to. You know, we collect the things that support our belief system. And I don't think any of us can help from doing that. The interesting thing about it is that actually has a name, and it's called confirmation bias. This is a new book, got it today, came in the mail. It's called Decisive. I've only read the introduction and probably the first 5 pages. But it was on this exact topic, and is why do we make bad decisions? Why do businesses bankrupt themselves? Why do they make terribly bad decisions? And there's 4 main points, but one of them has to do with this confirmation bias, because we tend to want to hear what we want to hear to support our positions. So what I'm asking you tonight, quite frankly, and I'm not doing this on Dave's behalf, I'm not doing it on my behalf or whatever, I'm asking you to try to set aside those inherent biases that you have and listen to the information presented so we can have a discussion, so that we can have an information session where we can learn things. And who knows, maybe our opinions will even change a little bit. Maybe they won't. I don't know. But this is the MainStream coalition, and I think by name, you know, what you all want is not necessarily to be polarized. But you, and I'm not saying compromise, but I think you want to know both sides, and then you can make your own decision. So I appreciate Dave being here. Dave and I'm not going to say we're friends, we don't socialize together. Maybe we'll go over to the what is it called, tavern on the whatever tonight for the first time. We'll, you know, and I won't drink because I don't drink. I don't know about Dave if he does or not. I'll have some iced tea. But you know, maybe we'll get to know each other a little bit better. But when we've done this kind of thing, I mean, we certainly don't have animosity between us. So that's just kind of sets the stage. I'm sorry, you know, I took so long to kind of say that. But that's kind of where I want to come from. I came more prepared to talk about the legislative issues, because Harry had mentioned that's what we were going to do, and Dave kind of got to those at the end. But because Dave spent so much time, you know, with kind of education and dollars and funding, I'm going to kind of refute some of that a little bit, kind of give it another side. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint really, really quickly, because then I want to pull up another PowerPoint and get right to the legislative issues that we're going to talk about. And I'm not going to try to bias you on those until the question and answer period. What I'm going to do is just explain what each of those pieces of legislation does, and then we can, you know, talk about that, you know, when we're answering questions, whatever, if that's all right. So anyway, first slide. You know, thanks for letting me be here. Main points. We want to talk about the legislation, and I want to counter some of the claims that are being levied against public education. I want to be sure that we hear the whole story. Because I think, once again, this confirmation bias thing has kind of got me stirred up a little bit. And I think there was some of that in Dave's presentation. Quite frankly, I think there's some of that in my presentation, too. It's not intentional, but I think it's there. And I think we need to be aware of that. Some of the criticisms that you heard, maybe we have too much money in reserves. I know they have a sheet that they put out that kind of implies that. Student achievement results are really poor. You saw... you know, that kind of that opinion. Money that's allocated to schools is not utilized, you know, the right way. Dave went through and talked about the different categories, and what you'll see the KPI using is this system where they take the number of students, the percent of students, and they call them proficient, and they include one fewer category than KSDE does. I've called KSDE, I've talked to them about that, I've said, are they right? Can they do that? Dave's opinion obviously is absolutely, you know, they've lowered the standards. KSDE says, no, we haven't lowered the standards. The way those standards were set are groups of teachers, teams of teachers coming together and deciding independently what a student needed to be able to perform on a certain test, how many questions they needed to get right to be determined proficient. Now, I can't talk to you about the definitions in Webster and all of that, but what I can tell you is teachers set those standards. And I don't believe teachers decided they were going to lower the standards for kids in Kansas because they've got integrity. They don't do that. It was never their intention to lower standards. I don't believe that happened. I could go into that. I'm going to kind of go, oh, dadgummit. I am going to show this one.
That's a good one.
Okay, I'm going to show this one again. But normally I can talk about it and then I can push the button. When it comes to have we improved or have we not, I want to show you Blue Valley student achievement from 2000 to 2012. What you're going to see is a graph. You're going to see a bunch of dots. They're color coded. Some are middle school, some are elementary, and some are high school. And as soon as I hit it, that's where they were in 2000, and then it's going to animate it, and it shows where those math standards and reading standards scores end up after 12 years of intervention, and where this money that has been spent, what good it has done. Now, it's not the NAEP like he was talking about, it is the Kansas State assessments, but I want to show this to you. It's going to go really fast, but what you're going to watch is these dots over time basically showing the student achievement that's happened in the Blue Valley School District. So here we go. Blue's elementary, red's middle, green's high school. You'll see some new schools joining us. About 2005, we started our strategic plan, and look what happened. We started focusing really on student achievement. 2007, 2008, everything. There's a new elementary, there's a new high school, there's a new middle school coming on, and that's where we end up after 10 years. And so I would argue the fact that money's not been well spent, because you can see tremendous gain and tremendous movement. Now, Dave would probably argue, well, that's because the standards are lower. I'm going to argue, no, that's not because the standards are lower, and I'm going to show you some Kansas results and statistics here in a minute, too. This is the same slide that Dave showed a minute ago about college readiness, dealing with ACT, only it's broken down into English, math, reading, and science. It's got the nation, it's got Kansas, and it's got Blue Valley. I want you to notice that Kansas is doing much better than the nation. I put Shawnee Mission up there. I'm sure they're doing much better than the state of Kansas as well. Most of you are probably from Shawnee Mission. And then this happens to be Blue Valley because that's near and dear to my heart at this particular time. But what you'll see is 48% of our kids score on the ACT and project success in college. The interesting thing is, if you take the number of kids that go to college in Blue Valley and how many of them go back for their second year, for their sophomore year, which means they must have been ready because they did really well, that number is 91%. So even though the ACT says 48% are college ready, almost double, 40-some% higher than that, really are doing really, really well. So obviously this is a really rigorous standard. I like it. It gives me room to grow. It lets me sit down with my principals and say, dadgum, there's less than half. We've got to put the burners on here. We've got to improve because we do need to improve, and we will improve. State rankings. Kansas ranks 6th overall out of 50 states on 11 national indicators when you put them all together, and we're 2nd in a 10-state region. So I think you need to keep in perspective, you know, when you've got the NAEP data and all that up there, there's NAEP data in this. When you compare Kansas with the rest of the country, folks, we're doing really, really well. I could go and I could read, you know, those others to you. You know, we rank 6th nationally in preparation for college, 3rd in our region, 8th in the nation in basic reading and math, all those kinds of things. That's just another one that talks about that. Funding. Here's the big thing with funding. Obviously, Dave's statistics are right. We're spending more dollars now, significantly more dollars now than we were, you know, back in 2000 or you know, whenever his numbers showed. That's overall spending. If you go back to 2008 and you look at the number of dollars that are going into operational expenditures, and that's what educates your kids. Capers are necessary. I mean, we've got state statute that regulates that. Lots and lots of dollars are going into capers. It needs to. It should. I mean, it's statutory, but that doesn't help educate your kids. State dollars going to lower property tax, lower assessed valuation districts that need help in terms of their bond payments. That's in that number that Dave talked about. That's overall numbers. What my concern is, and that should be of concern to you as a taxpayer. It absolutely should be, and it's a concern to me too. But my biggest concern is what about the dollars going in to educate kids, going into the classroom? Folks, they've not gone up, they've gone down. And I guarantee you, we wouldn't have laid off 30-some teachers, we wouldn't have laid off 60-some classified people, we wouldn't have cut administrative team at the district office, we would have gotten rid of our school improvement specialists, done all of those kinds of cost cutting if we would have had to. Spending for operational that goes into the classroom is not increasing, it's going down. And it has been going down, and that's the trend that we need to reverse. I won't argue that overall spending's going up. You saw that. But I've got to focus on what's it take to educate those kids in the classroom, because that's how we're going to get an increase in student achievement, I believe. And so I think funding does matter. School spending as a percent of Kansas personal income. If you go all the way back, and I'm not sure, I can't even read this, I don't know when it, 1999 maybe, I'm not sure. But as you go through, as a percent of personal income, we're not spending any more in the state of Kansas than we were previous, and that's total and that's operational. Blue is the operational, red is the total spending. So what's coming out of our pocketbooks in terms of percentage has not changed over time. What I want to do, and I think I mentioned this, is simply to talk about the bills so that you know what kind of questions to ask, so that you know what bills are out there. I don't expect you to follow what's going on in Topeka as closely as Dave does, or as closely as I do. Let me, before I do that, let me talk a little bit about the governor's budget plan, just so we're all on the same page here. The governor's budget plan, the governor has a huge hole to fill because of last year's tax plan. The revenue stream is going to be cut dramatically, about $500 million or so over the next couple of years. And so in order to hold schools harmless, and I commend the governor because he said from the very beginning he was not going to cut base state aid per pupil to schools. He was going to do everything he could to keep it there. In order to be able to do that, he's got a tax plan that's being debated right now. And what that tax plan does is it tries to fill that $500 million hole. A part of that tax plan, what would happen is that we would stay the same in terms of our base state aid per pupil at $38.38 for the next year. We'd get a small increase at $38.52 the year after that, and that's basically because assessed valuation across the state's going up, so the 20 mil levy would raise a little bit more money. But in order to do that, what he's got in his plan is to extend the sales tax that's set on June 30 to expire, eliminate the mortgage deduction when it comes to income tax, and also have some transfers to the general fund from the state transportation fund, which are pretty sizable. And those things all together will, in essence, hold us harmless in terms of keeping the base state aid per pupil the same. Now, I want to remind you, this is not new for the governor. The governor, a year ago, when he first proposed his plan, said it's going to be revenue neutral. I want to take the rates down, but I also want to eliminate deductions. So all he's done is come back with what he originally wanted to see happen. The main difference is, a year ago, he wanted to stair-step it in, which quite frankly, I think makes all the sense in the world. And had we done that, we wouldn't have a $500 million deficit, and that's not the governor's fault, because that's what he wanted. Now he's faced with this, and I'm not here to stand up and laud the governor or legislature or whatever. I'm just hopefully presenting information. But bottom line is, we're in the position we're in, and this is how he's trying to fill that. As a school district person, I look at this, I'm in favor of it, because I know what's going to happen if it doesn't pass. If we don't fill that hole, he can't keep his promise. So for me, believing in schools and believing in kids, I want this plan to pass. I'll just tell you that right now. That's a personal opinion, but I'm in favor of it because I don't know how else to solve the problem, and I think this has a chance to solve it. Okay, I think I just explained that. The Gannon decision, just so people are aware, basically said fund the law. The law says basic aid per pupil should be $44.92. It's statutory. It's in there right now. I don't think the court actually prescribed a number, just picked it out of thin air. They said, legislature, you've already said that's what it's supposed to be. Just do it. I mean, that's the way I interpret, the supposed proactive court. I mean, they didn't come up with their own number. They said, fund the number that you've come up with. And obviously, we've got a lot of disagreement about that. It would cost $460 million. We've got some equalization aid that has to come in. Courts spoke really big time on equalization aid. which really doesn't do much for Johnson County, does a whole lot for the rest of the state. And then capital outlay, I won't talk about that, but that one's a real concern for us if that doesn't get equalized pretty quick. Critical issues. Dave mentioned this, Senate Concurrent Resolution 1608 talks about educational funding. I'm sure there'll be some questions on that, and I'll opine on that. Dave also talked about the Paycheck One payroll deductions, House Bill 2023. 2027 is the new bill that talks about teachers' negotiations. That's changed dramatically in the last couple of days, so probably we're going to want to talk about that in the question and answer period. I got 2 minutes, okay? House Bill 2271, I think people need to be aware of this. It would move school board elections to the fall. It makes them partisan, and it mandates that you'd have to have 7 at-large positions. Right now in Johnson County, everybody does it by areas. Olathe was the most recent one to go to not having 7 at large, and they did it because their patrons demanded it. Because I remember, watching that, and this would throw all that out and make everybody go back to at large positions. We had a voucher program, 2263, for special ed kids. That one's dead now, from what I understand. Bullying, 2222, might want to talk about a little bit. That's interesting because it was amended to now include parents in the statute. Any bullying with students, with parents, or with staff, they're all lumped in there together. 3rd grade retention based on reading scores, I think that's dead, but we should talk about that. I know the Senate Education Committee did not bring that out of committee. Prohibiting Carnegie units to be used for graduation, I don't know, you may not care a lot about that one, but it's something we can talk about. Prohibiting Common Core state standards, I'm not sure exactly where that came from, but it might be worth some talk. Changing at-risk weighting from free lunch to proficiency for grades 4 and above. That got a lot of play. I don't think that's going to go anywhere, and I'd be more than happy to talk about that one. I see David back in the room, and I know David's there, an adamant opponent to that. Somebody else, Cindy's back there too? Hi, Cindy. So maybe we can get you to talk about that a little bit if we have time. I'm not the moderator. I'm sorry, Harry. You can only talk if Harry will let you. Okay. And then we have a week in September to learn about the sacrifices and values on which our country was founded. The Innovative School District, 10 districts, that looks like that's going to go through. It's kind of a district charter bill. Let's see, another charter school legislation, a local activities budget. I don't think that's probably going to go anyplace. Requirement for special services for dyslexia outside of the school system to go to private. I think that one got modified substantially. The 65% one, we can talk about that if we want, and I'll come back there if we need to. It's all yours. I'm sorry for going so fast.
No, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to hand the mic over when our speakers answer questions, and I'm going to ask both of you, even though you both tried to mince your words as best you could, I'm going to ask you to try to limit your comments to about a minute so that we can get through as many of these questions as we can, because we are going to adjourn at 8:30. Okay? And we have what I predicted. We have lots of questions submitted. We have lots of questions that fall into the same general areas. So I'm just going to start, and a huge number of these questions dealt with the issue of the constitutional amendments and funding. Okay, so basically you both presented a point of view, and I would just ask you, and when we answer these questions I'm going to alternate which one goes first here. But since Tom just spoke, I'm going to let you have the first say and comment about I guess kind of try to rebut a little bit Tom's comments about the need for constitutional reform in terms of budget per pupil and whether or not the courts actually, whatever we want to say,
sure.
I forget what the word is, appropriated funds.
Okay. The Constitution says the legislature is the only entity that can appropriate money. The reason that the 4492 is in statute is that the court held a gun to the legislature's head and said, if you don't do this, basically, we're going to shut schools down. So yes, the legislature passed a law. They did it under duress. There is absolutely no question that the separation of powers doctrine lays out the responsibilities of the three branches of government. And all this constitutional amendment would do would say the court's role is to determine constitutionality. The legislature's role is to determine whether there's an adequate or how to do it. The court can still come back. So it's simply saying that the legislature has its role in appropriating money, which is in the Constitution. The court can decide constitutionality, but they cannot appropriate money.
My comment would simply be that the way that the amendment is worded, I don't know that it would always be interpreted the way that Dave has just said. I'm hearing a number of legislators even express concern that even if that's the intent, that's not really what it says, and that it would greatly inhibit school districts' abilities to sue the state if they felt like the legislature was not meeting their constitutional task, and that it would give the legislature, quite frankly, too much power over the court system. I don't know the answer, but because of the confusion, I'm opposed to that constitutional amendment. I think it needs to be worded in a way that we absolutely know what it says and what it means, so there's no confusion at the ballot box. And I don't think it's worded that way at this point in time at all. I'm really concerned that it would limit school districts' abilities or parents' abilities to go to the court system for relief if they felt like the legislature was not upholding their end of the bargain.
Okay, Tom, and you might as well stay standing because you'll be first up on this question. So we've had a number of people asking about the teachers' rights and collective bargaining, et cetera. And they come from a variety of perspectives, but basically, as you see it as a superintendent, do teachers having rights for collective bargaining and assessment of dues collected by school districts, is that hampering school districts? Would you favor either or those approaches, or are you neutral on that, or give us your opinion?
That's two bills, so I get 2 minutes.
Yeah. Well, no. You get 30 seconds per bill.
I can't do that. Let me talk about the collective bargaining first, and it's going to take a little while. This is a hard one. I mean, I'll do my very, very best. The bill, the way it's been written, does not do away with collective bargaining. There still is collective bargaining. What it does is it limits collective bargaining, mandatory collective bargaining, to basically salaries, benefits, and leave time. It takes everything else and makes it mutually agreeable to bargain if both sides agree to do that. And then there are a couple of things, evaluation and I think assignment during the school day, that could not ever be negotiated. That's, in essence, that's the first half of the bill, and we won't even get to the next half of it. This is a really hard one because, for me, because first, we have a great relationship with our association. If this passes, we will continue to collaborate and work with our teachers association. We may have to do it outside of the bargaining process, but we will sit down and we will see what they want. We will ask their opinions. That's just the way we are. And I think that's the way most districts work and interact. I will say, however, for management to have the final say when it comes to, say, budget cutting, and there were some items during budget cutting that we couldn't implement because it had to go through collective bargaining. That made it really, really difficult. That really narrowed the board's choices. This would broaden that again. I'm not saying that we would necessarily, go to do some of those kinds of things, but the board would have more options. And so I view that, as a positive. But in no way do I want to imply that I think teachers shouldn't have the ability to sit at a table with us and talk through those issues and work and help us solve problems collaboratively, because we will do that. We absolutely will. In terms of the paycheck protection thing, how do I want to say this? It has not been an issue for us whatsoever. On one side, obviously some people think that there is pressure to To join the association, and for those people that don't want to pay dues, to go for political purposes, that you pretty much have to do that. On the other side, the vast majority of teachers I talk to say, no, that's not the case at all. I mean, someone said it's our money, we ought to be able to do with what we want, whatever. There will be a solution. I mean, if that passes, there will be a direct withdrawal or a direct deposit or some way for teachers to be able to make that contribution. So I don't see that as a deal breaker. My biggest concern is, what's the motive behind it? If the motive behind it was to break a union, I don't like it. I don't like it. We had somebody from the Kansas Chamber slipped up and said that. Now, I don't know if that's the Kansas Chamber position. I don't know that I care. All I know is that there are some people that feel that way, and I totally disagree with that. I want to work with our teachers. I want them to have, collective bargaining rights. In terms of this bill, does it limit those? I'll make some of you mad on the other side now. Yeah, I as administrator would like to have more management rights when it comes to that. So now I've angered both sides, and I'll pass it off to Dave.
And I'll try to be a little shorter than that, because I agree with pretty much everything he said. And this is not, just so you know where I'm coming from, before I worked with Kansas Policy Institute, I ran companies that were, I think every one was unionized. And I did a lot of the negotiations personally. And one of my letters of recommendation when I came back to Kansas was from the local union president. We got along really well, and I commend Tom for having that attitude, because that's the same approach we tried to take. We didn't look at negotiating as a 60-day period or a 90-day period. It was a relationship that went on all the time. But there are things, and this is what, like I said before, everything we do in education has to be kid-focused. And so while it might be uncomfortable, it might not be what the adults might want, management does have to have the final say, because they are the ones who have to make the decision that's in the kids' best interest. Now, on the paycheck protection, we didn't take a position on that. All we did was do the public opinion. We were actually doing a roll of government opinion poll, and just threw that question in at the end and shared that information with the legislature. I can tell you, though, from having worked with a lot of folks in the union, some of whom loved it and lived and breathed it, and that's wonderful. I don't have a problem. I was in a union when I was in college. But some people do feel pressured, and it doesn't have to be overt. That's the reason that when my kids were little, it drove them crazy, because I wouldn't take the candy or the wrapping paper or anything else into work, because I didn't want to make my employees feel obligated to buy something from the boss. So my kids still haven't forgiven me for that. They didn't win any of the prizes. But there can be pressure without it being overt.
Okay, you'll be first up on the next question.
Okay.
So a lot of questions dealt with the bill that purports to or says they will prevent Kansas school districts or the state board from implementing Common Core. Would you comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, we testified on Common Core, and there are a lot of things in Common Core is not the same, but it's very similar to No Child Left Behind. And there are a lot of things about No Child Left Behind that educators really don't like. That's part of the reason that federal law got us going on a bad path, I think. And I think a lot of educators agree with that. There's a lot of those same things in Common Core. And
would you just mention one, because Common Core is relating to education standards, but it's a voluntary thing, number one. It's not done by the federal government, number two. So there's no federal enforcement mechanism other than what states agree to do. So could you tell me what is similar to No Child Left Behind with Common Core?
Well, first of all, and it is voluntary. It's voluntary because of the Supreme Court ruling on the Affordable Care Act. Because the states can states can't, the government, federal government holds states accountable on No Child Left Behind and a lot of other things. If you don't do this, all the money goes away.
Well, it's also, it's not developed by the federal government. This is not funded by the government. It was developed by state governor association, right? And
it was developed through the State Governors Association with a lot of input from corporate interests.
okay.
Okay? So, pardon me?
Koch brothers, correct?
No, not on Common Core. No.
No.
All right. But that's not. We're talking Common Core right now. We're talking Common
So
Core.
there were outside. The problem is, education should be at the local level, in my opinion. I don't think whether it should be the federal government deciding how it should be done, or it's outside corporate interests that are helping to design these things. So there's a lot of things about Common Core and what gets taught and how, the whole concept of how you teach to a test. But in the case of Kansas, we actually were neutral on Common Core because we go back to where we are, where our achievement levels are, and where we have, and by the way, when we published the information on how Kansas had reduced standards in 2002 and 2006, before we published that information, we sent it to Commissioner DeBacker. We sent it to the state board chair and said, is there anything inaccurate in this? And they didn't respond. And we made sure they had an opportunity to tell us if there was anything inaccurate, because it all came from their information. They gave it to us. There's no question, even the U.S. Department of Education agrees, Kansas has some of the lowest performance standards. Not what we try to hit, but how we measure it. The performance standard is low. And so we said our position was, as much as it pained us on some of the things we were concerned about, in Kansas, the Common Core might actually be better because that might be the only way we get higher standards.
Common Core is definitely going to raise standards. It's definitely going to raise standards, not just in Kansas, but all across the country. Common Core is getting at, it's getting away from simply measuring paper and pencil, basic skills tests, and it's going to propel us to where we're going to begin to measure and teach inquiry, where we're going to teach critical thinking, where we're going to do, I think, a better job of teaching higher order skills. And so for that reason, I'm a proponent of Common Core. Is there a little bit of me that says, yeah, I really wish it was being totally developed locally? Sure. But the reality is we don't have the time, we don't have the resources to develop this type of curriculum district by district across the state of Kansas. I have confidence in KSDE when it comes to Common Core. They get to have, I believe, about 15% of their state assessments will be unique to Kansas with those Common Core standards. From what I've seen, from what my educational services people tell me, this is a very positive step for our kids. And they're going to learn more, they're going to learn better, they're going to be held to higher standards, and I think that's a positive thing. So I'm pro-Common Core. I don't believe that it's federal government mandated. You can make kind of a tie to the waiver system, I understand that, but I don't think anybody's sold out to the waiver system because of Common Core. I really don't think that happened.
Okay, so you mentioned that when we were talking about budget per pupil and the governor's tax plan and the funding flat this year, but budget per pupil and a small increase next year, and that in light of the idea that if we don't get that plan, you might end up with less, right? And so, not saying that that's adequate, but you also referenced laying off some teachers, decreasing administrative staff, decreasing maintenance and other certified staff, so or non-certified. So anyway, basically, can Blue Valley, looking out to the future, continue to not only provide the education it does, but meet the needs of the diversity of students that you're faced with, increasing numbers of English language learners, students from lower income, etc. You know, can you continue to provide the quality education if budget per pupil stays flat? So we're not talking about you're afraid it's going to go down, but just look at the future. Do we need budget per pupil to stay flat?
The answer to the question is, as I look to the future, we don't have a choice. We have to continue to excel. We have to continue to meet kids, and we have to continue to meet the needs of kids in ways that we've never done before. We don't have a choice. I mean, we have to figure out a way to do it. In terms of the financial piece, 87% of our budget goes to salaries and benefits. I mean, we're a service industry. The rest of our budget goes to things like utilities, insurance, fixed cost kinds of things that I don't have any control over. So if our budget continues to stay flat, the base aid per pupil, or goes down, we don't have any alternative really other than to reduce staff, whether that's classified, certified, administrative, whatever. And I'm here to tell you, if we have to do that, it's just going to make it more and more and more difficult to provide the quality of education that our kids deserve and that you all expect. What I can't do as an educator is sit here and tell you the quality is going to go down, because I can't let it go down. I won't let it go down. And that's the catch-22. That's what's so hard, because we can't let it happen, and yet I'm afraid I don't know how we're going to do it unless we get some additional operational funding. Our communities want to provide that. They want local control. Over and over they tell us, when I tell people we can't raise money, you know, to go towards operating expenditures, and they find out that it's a state law and we're capped, that really angers them. People want quality education. They want to provide it. That's what they tell me. And the only way to do that is through additional local control measures. So that's what we're going to try to do. Now, understand, that's kind of a Johnson County position. Across the state, there are many districts that don't have that kind of support, or maybe they don't have that kind of tax base. They've got to have state support. They have to have it, because they're in the same or worse position that we're in. That's why it's a dual effort. We need local control for districts like, you know, here in Johnson County. We need more state support for districts that are all across this state, some of them just across county line.
Now, you mentioned that you'd had to lay off staff, and you'll work hard, and part of that equation is your teachers working hard. And I've read where it wasn't a survey in Blue Valley, but across the state, across the nation, teacher stress is increasing, that teachers are leaving the profession because of this. And now we've got in Kansas an attack on teachers' rights and collective bargaining rights and dues withhold. You know, doesn't that play into making it difficult for you if not only are teachers in stress because there are fewer of them providing just as great a services to increase class sizes, but now we've got attacks on their professional organizations? Does that hinder you in any way?
Add to that the fact that administratively we continue to put more pressure on teachers to do more with less and to do a better job in raising standards. I mean, that's the third pressure that they're feeling right now. I'm obviously very pro-teacher. I think Dave's the one that said it. The teacher in the classroom, that's the key. That is the key to quality education. There is no doubt about it. You put a quality teacher in that classroom, things are going to go extremely well. Kids are going to learn. You don't, and we've got major problems.
Can the schools of Kansas continue to provide the necessary opportunity for kids if our assessment or our base state aid per pupil stays flat into the future?
Sure. Absolutely. It's not easy, but it can be done, and I say that because I've seen it done. What Florida has done and they still have a long way to go. But on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, Florida, when you start looking at the individual demographics, and this is why you can't compare state averages any more than you can compare Blue Valley with Kansas City, Kansas. I mean, we all understand that. Completely different demographics. Cannot compare one district to another. For the same reason you can't compare one state to another. But you can look at the individual student cohorts. You can look at low income to low income. You can look at white to white and Hispanic to Hispanic and so forth. What Florida has done they have shown remarkable growth in their achievement levels, and especially in closing achievement gaps. Florida's Hispanic students have better scores on the NAEP than many states' overall average. Now the significant, and this is where this ties in, Harry, if Kansas had spent at the same per pupil level as Florida did, and just on current spending, not on any kind of capital or debt, between 1999 and 2010, we would have spent $4.3 billion less in Kansas. I'm not saying we should have. The point is, they spent a lot less money per pupil, and they had a lot of gains. Now, there's no silver bullet. What you have to do, there's a lot of different things that you implement, all student-focused reforms. Now, where you can get some of the money, and it goes back to where I said it's not how, I mean, it costs a lot of money, no question, but it's how you spend the money, not how much. So think about Panera down the road. You know how many Paneras there are around here. Would it make sense for Panera at that store to have its own payroll system, its own accounting system, its own everything? Of course not. But that's how we have our school districts organized. And so one of the ways that we can get more money available into the classroom is to consolidate some of these outside the classroom functions across district lines. So now, you might not, because you're used to big districts here, you have what, 22,000 students. The average level, I mean, we're talking about districts with 200 kids. Districts, 300, 400, 500. Hundreds of districts like that. So we have 286 payroll systems and 286 transportation systems. All this extra overlap costs money, so you find ways to work those things together and put that money into the classroom.
I asked Tom a follow-up, so let me ask you a follow-up,
okay,
somewhat related to this. This was submitted by a person, evidently in 2012, you reported to the Kansas Watchdog that Colorado and Texas posted better scores on the ACT than Kansas does. But whoever submitted this said that in looking at ACT.org, it's actually Kansas had better ACT scores than Colorado or Texas for 11 and 12, and that this person researched back for 13 years and couldn't find a situation where Texas or Colorado scored better than us. So I was wondering how you got that information. And it relates to this question because you're talking about Florida and they made great gains, but Florida general overall excellence in education was considerably less than us.
So this is one of the charts that's in, now let me start back. When we said that Colorado and Texas had better scores, that was on the NAEP. I think the question was about ACT. Okay. I'd have to look. I can't recall off the top of my head. We do have, but when again, what they were looking at, I'm sure, was a state average. You can't look at a state average because of these different demographic mixes. You saw the achievement gaps. And again, it's not, they shouldn't be there. We can do something about that. But if you understand the demographic mix, for example, the typical Hispanic kid is about 2 years behind the typical white kid. That's in Kansas, that's across the country. So when you look at a state score, you have Kansas, which has, I think, 68 or 69% white kids and about 14% Hispanic. Now you look at Texas, on the other hand, has, I think, 33% white and about 48% Hispanic. I'm trying to remember a lot of these percentages off the top of my head. The weighted average is going to dramatically skew the overall, those weights skew the overall average. If you look at the individual cohort, Texas had, well, Colorado had the best score with white kids. Texas had the best score with Hispanic kids and African American kids. And they were all close to Kansas, all close. Texas also had a little bit better score. It wasn't the best in the region, but it was a little bit better score than white kids in Kansas. So you have to look at the individual cohort. You cannot compare because otherwise you're comparing apples and oranges, really.
Okay. All right. We have time for, excuse me, you'll be up first.
Okay.
We have time for one last question. We have many more to ask, but if before we adjourn across the street, I'm sure people might want to come up and ask you individually questions. We've had considerable talk about local control and nicer if we do things at a local level. We also have had talk about constitutional amendments because of one branch of our government getting into areas reserved for another branch. Yet, in this legislative session, where we have, by law and by Constitution, actually created a Department of Education, and by law it has powers over general supervision of the delivery of education. But we've got a legislature that has tried to insert unscientific climate change into the classroom, has tried to meddle with how local school boards decide their graduation requirements, dealing with Carnegie units, have attempted, instead of letting parents, administrators, counselors, and school psychologists determine whether or not an individual student should be retained, tried to implement a one-size-fits-all third grade retention based on reading, is trying to redefine at-risk so that fewer students will qualify for at-risk funding, which will be one way to fund our schools better. We just will disqualify some kids from getting help. They've tried to prevent the implementation of Common Core standards. They've tried to implement a Celebrate Freedom Week, but once again, it's requiring schools to do a certain thing. So what would you comment overall on all of this legislation that our legislature is trying to implement and force the State Board of Ed and local school districts to enforce?
Sure. Well, no, that's a great question, and there's not an easy answer or a short answer to that.
Well, we need it to be pretty short because.
Well, you're imposing restrictions.
Well, without talking. Yes,
He's trying to do to me what the legislature's.
Not so
No, I
much comment
understand.
on each one. It's the idea that the legislature should be getting into this at all.
Any legislature, I don't care whether it's in Kansas or whether it's Democrat or Republican or polka dot, can come up with some harebrained ideas. And I don't think it's good to try to paste. Now, there's been a lot of different changes here, but a lot of them are really focused on the legislature. Imagine, you all have kids probably. Imagine you had a setup where somehow the kids, like in a democracy, a pure democracy, you have 3 kids and 2 parents. The kids win. So the kids would be in charge of how things get spent and what happens. Your role as parents, because you're in the minority, is just to fund it. The legislature in Kansas has an obligation to do the funding, and they also have, by Constitution and by statute, they have authority to have some say, not complete, but to have some say. And you may not agree with everything, and I don't agree with everything that the legislature, this one or past, has come up with. But a lot of those things, and I'll give you a great example, third grade reading. The simple thing, there are kids we know who cannot read. They test in the bottom of 5 measurements. We know they cannot read, and yet we promote them to 4th grade.
Do we promote all kids to 4th grade? Aren't there kids who are retained across the state?
There may be. The significance, there's significance about reading is that you learn to read in the first few years. Then you read to learn. If you don't learn, if a kid hasn't learned to read, the default should be make sure that kid learns to read before moving them on. Now, you don't wait until then. You start sooner. You have to start sooner. And when you do, you actually get some of the parental involvement you're looking for. So, yeah, some of the things, I don't agree with what the legislature is doing in every case. But, and I'll go back to...
There is some research about retention that retention by itself isn't necessarily a solution to an education problem, which is, I think, why local school districts, administrators, parents, counselors don't retain every kid. They make decisions now on a case-by-case basis. How can it possibly be in the best interests of Kansas kids for a legislature not certified in education at all to make a decision that this is what they want done?
The way we would have set it up, if we wrote that law, was you have, and it's based on what they do in Florida. They have a third grade retention program that has a default, that also has options. I mean, they have a trigger in there that says if the parent insists, the kid can still be promoted. They have waivers you can get. But what they have found in tracking those kids is that within a year, the kids who were held back are already way ahead of the kids who barely made the cut. It is in the kids' best interest to make sure they know how to read. And that's all this is about. And
we need to let Tom have a couple minutes because it's time to stop.
Okay.
So.
Well, I just want to go back to, in terms of the legislature having oversight, having some say on what's going in the Department of Education, I keep going back to, this is a Department of Education that has given us some of the lowest performance standards in the nation, according to the U.S. Department of Education. And so I think it makes good sense to ask a lot of questions about what we're doing and to have some other opinion on it.
Okay. Thank you.
A couple of quick responses and then I'll answer your question. You know, if indeed it's true we have some of the lowest standards in the nation, then I question how we're in the top 10 in terms of NAEP scores overall.
Oh, that's easy.
I mean,
No. Okay. All right. Now, wait. We gotta.
Now, I'll give you. If you come up afterwards, I'll give you that explanation. It takes about 10 seconds.
When it comes to some of the bills, and Harry, you talked about the retention bill. Everybody's on the same page that we all want kids to be able to read, and we all want them to be able to read by the 4th grade. The question is, what's the best way to make that happen? And that's where the disagreement is. Some people think the best way is retention. A lot of us feel like there are other intervention methods that are going to ultimately do the child more good than retention. And we don't want retention mandated. Now, should that be in the toolkit? Are there some kids where it absolutely would make sense? Yeah, but I think you're right, Harry. I think a lot of those kids are being retained when the education professionals decide that that really is the right thing to do, and they work with the parents, and the parents are in agreement, and they try to work with that. The real answer, quite frankly, is better education preschool, better education early elementary, and you got to start way back then. And we don't have universal preschool. I mean, we don't have it. I mean, lots of parents cannot afford that, and we need a better program for that. Okay, in terms of the legislature itself, you know, the reality is a lot of those bills aren't going to pass. And I think we have to look at that and say, in some cases, you know, people really are trying to look at both sides as legislators, and they really aren't all on the same page, and they all aren't out 100% to see that certain things happen, that there is dialogue going on, and some of those bills that I think most of us here in the room, and Dave to some extent too, I think would agree with, that really are not going to make a difference, they're not going to make their way through. So I think that's a positive thing. Now, there are some bills that are going to make their way through that are going to change the way we do some things. We're going to have to adjust and adapt to that. We don't have a choice when it comes to that. We're going to have to do it. So I'm one that doesn't believe in unfunded mandates. I don't like to be mandated too. I would much rather have more local control. And we're just going to have to continue to work with our local legislators to try to see that that happens. I'm going to make one final comment because I'd be remiss if I didn't. Because you may want to ask some questions of this person too. Cindy Lane's in the back room. Cindy Lane, Kansas City, Kansas Superintendent. David Smith's back there. Cindy knows how I feel about this, but I want to be sure you know how I feel about this too. It costs more money to educate kids in poverty. It absolutely costs more money. Now, I can't tell you how much, I can't tell you the best way to fund it or to measure it or whatever, But I know that if at-risk should change, and I don't think it's going to, but if it should change, there's got to be another way to backfill for poverty. There's got to be, because it costs more money. And we've got to be looking at this thing as in terms of every child in the state of Kansas. Every kid needs to have the opportunity to excel. If they decide they want to get a college education, they've got to be prepared and be able to do it. If they decide they want to go to trade school or community college or military, whatever, they need choices. And kids, whether it's in Wichita, Kansas City, Kansas, Topeka, Shawnee Mission, Blue Valley, Olathe, wherever, every one of those kids counts and matters. And we've got to be worried about every one of those. That's it.
Let's have a big round of applause for both our speakers. Thank you very much, Dave, Tom.
Quickly before everyone leaves, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Thank our panel, thank the church, Aaron Roberts, thank you Colonial for having us, and to our board and committee for putting this on. We have a lot of school board members here and former electeds, and it's just great to see such a huge turnout on a cold night. Public education has been a mainstream issue basically since our founding. We were founded with the focus on separation of church and state. We got involved in public education when vouchers were the big topic, and as we expanded our focus and really became the rational voice, the moderate voice, we couldn't leave public education on the table, and have expanded our focus beyond vouchers and really have taken a strong stand that the mainstream voice, the moderate voice, is for strong public schools. And with that, MainStream has an education task force. It's chaired by Karen Wagner, who you met at the beginning, and former Representative Cheryl Spalding. And we're going to be working on this issue, and we're going to continue to advocate. MainStream testified a half dozen times this session already, twice on education issues. Harry testified, the Senate Judiciary, on the proposed change to the constitutional amendment. Oh, both times. And we testified this week on the Celebrate Freedom bill. Micheline Berger testified we were the only testimony for or against. So MainStream is there, but what we really need is all of you with us. Whether you join this committee or you join MainStream, not that anyone in this room wouldn't be a member, but
Do feel pressure, though.
but the reason for membership is so we can stay connected with you, and it's great to see a room of almost 200 people actively engaged in this issue, and it's great to have different perspectives and really understand the tensions on the issue. MainStream has taken a stand on this. We are against changing the state constitution. We believe in the mandate that the legislature suitably fund public education. Hopefully many of you got this action sheet at your table. At your seat. If you didn't, we'll be emailing it out to everyone who is here tonight. So if you weren't on the list and you didn't leave your email, do that or join, and we'll get it that way. But here's the action. The Kansas legislature must not shirk its commitment to adequately fund public education by removing the court's authority to enforce the suitable provision for finance of education. The current Kansas Constitution clearly reflects the values of Kansans. We don't need to change it to allow the legislature to underfund education. To make it a little bit easier, there's a petition. It's online. You can go to changekansas.org and you'll see the petition. If you click and you fill out, put your name on the petition, it automatically will send an email to your elected official. So do that, call them, email them if you have a relationship, but please stay connected. And then more so, of course, we've got 200 voices here, but if we each reach out to the 5 or 10 people that we know and really push them to get their voices heard, that will make the difference. So on that note, I want to turn it over, make sure I didn't miss anything, turn it over to Lisa Vaglin, who is on our membership committee, and we'll close it out for the evening.
And then we'll let you leave, we promise. I am Lisa Vaglin. I'm a new member of the MainStream Coalition, and I am a proud graduate of Shawnee Mission Schools, and about 13 years ago I moved back here consciously to educate my own children in Shawnee Mission, so I have a very big stake in the future of public education in Kansas, both as a parent and as a taxpayer. And I know everyone here feels the same way. So I was really pleased to be involved in MainStream for a number of reasons, but partly because of their commitment to public education and strong public schools, which Brandy talked about. So I just encourage you again. I know as a parent, I'm busy and it seems like there's too much to do and it's hard to sort of keep track of all of these things, but it's really a critical time, and it's really, I know so many people that want to know what to do and how to get involved, and MainStream gives you a great opportunity to become more informed, to become more educated, and to give you tools for advocacy. So I really encourage you to join MainStream if you're not a member. If you think you're a member but don't remember the last time you wrote that renewal check, we're happy to let you know and keep you involved. I like MainStream's theme that we're a rational voice in irrational times. I really encourage you to add your voice to MainStream's voice on all of the issues that we're working on. If you'd like to continue sharing your voice, we're going to be continuing the conversation across the street at the Tavern in Prairie Village. So please bring your voice there if you want to. And our next forum will be here back on March 21st here at Colonial Church again, coming back to legislating religious freedom, challenges to the relationship between church and state, which is, of course, MainStream's really foundational issue that they were founded on 20 years ago. So we hope to see you back then, and thank you very much. Thank you, both of you, for joining us this evening. Thank you.